Welcome to EXOTV. I'm Ronan Harrington.
My name's Sara Zaltash.
EXOTV would be like Wayne's World if Wayne and Garth were into systems change rather than heavy metal music. We are we've upgraded to our mate Phil's office where we no longer have to use Luke's terrible 4G and we get to use the wonders of Wi-Fi. So we're hoping for a show that has really good sound and picture quality like you see in some mainstream broadcasting TV sense.
It's so amazing how many different people are supporting the rebellion. This is a team of filmmakers in Soho that have just given us this space to use. Like, that is some serious support we're getting out there.
Yeah, and you'll see in our makeshift studio we have a fake plant and we have an XOR flag, and that's about it. If you'd like to donate to our ever-expanding studio, please feel free to. On today's show we're going to give you the rundown of day 412 of the rebellion.
412,008.
It's like in Rebellion you have like dog years where every single day is 7 days.
Yes, and it really is all determined by how many Hare Krishna meals you've had that day.
So on today's show we're going to give you a rundown of basically all the dramatic stuff that happened. What is in store, Sarah?
So we went to see the Queen going past with all of her special men on their horses. That was nice. And the XR rebels went and stopped traffic outside Bank. That was pretty cool. We have some footage from the other day where rebels came out in solidarity for the disabled protesters who weren't able to protest because the police have confiscated their stuff. And
we also have clips of you trying to get someone to...
Mate, like, so many people have been saying that I need to have a wash, so I thought I'd give it a go.
Okay, so speaking of the opposite of the great unwashed, we'll take you back to our coverage of the Queen's speech, the big political event of today. We're joined just on Pall Mall down from Buckingham Palace, where you see the Queen going past in full ceremony and pomp. She's about to deliver the Queen's speech for the state opening of Parliament in week 2 of Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion have been back to ask a very basic question of the government. What is your plan? It's been 6 months since Parliament declared a climate emergency, and now we see through the Queen it's going to be the announcement of the government's programme for the year. The question is, will it actually be an emergency Queen's speech? Will it be a speech that actually speaks about what the government will do for a climate emergency, or will it be another lip service that is paid to the climate crisis? And so this event is full of ceremony and pomp, and in a way that symbolism is designed to shore up the legitimacy of the establishment and the political order, but that is an establishment and an order that is crumbling unless it addresses the great emergency and crisis of our time.
I've come down to the front by the railings to get a better look at the men in the red coats and the funny black hats. You could call them the other Red Brigade in this rebellion. Ronan, you're also on the political strategy team for XR. Could you tell the people at home who don't really understand what the Queen's speech is about what's going on?
So the first thing is that the Queen's speech isn't actually a speech by the Queen herself. She's given a script, a speech by the government in which she outlines the programme of government for the year for the state opening of Parliament. So this is where the government outlines its legislative agenda. So all eyes are on, okay, what does the government prioritise? Now what's very interesting is that this is the first Queen's speech in 2 years. It's generally been postponed because of Brexit, and it's also going to be at a time when Parliament 6 months ago declared a climate emergency. And so I think a question that a lot of us are asking within the rebellion is, will this speech reference climate emergency? If it didn't, if the Queen didn't mention emergency in a house that had declared emergency, it would be this Emperor's New Clothes moment. But we expect that it won't be mentioned, that only lip service will be paid. We know that the environment is only one of 22 bills that will be tabled in the Queen's speech. And so it seems that the government is prioritising the great emergency 122 times.
So it sounds to me like this is basically a symbolic thing, that it's not really a speech, that instead it's like she's acting out a part. Now, XR really understands the power of symbolism, and we understand that that's a way to be able to reach people in a way that like facts and rhetoric doesn't. Do you think that the Queen understands the power of symbolism?
Well, I'm a big fan of The Crown on Netflix, and so I feel I have an intimate understanding of Queen Elizabeth's life. And I would say that the whole idea of the monarchy is a symbolic upholding of the political order, of the establishment. And so all of this pomp and ceremony is designed really to say one thing: we are strong, we are a united kingdom. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. This is a time of the most division in British politics. Indeed, the Queen's speech was a tactical ploy to prorogue Parliament, to stop MPs from debating Brexit, because we're in those closing days. And so the question is there substance to that solidity? And I would say at a time of climate emergency, when there's been an ongoing rebellion all around Westminster, that this shoring up of legitimacy is in doubt. As we see more and more the early warning signs of climate emergency come, things like crop failure in Europe, northern European countries having 50% lower yields, knowing that 77% of our fruit and veg comes from overseas, that we've just-in-time supply chains. This is how the climate emergency is now moving towards. It's questions about supermarket shelves and whether they'll be empty or not. It's questions about whether the 2050 legislative target will actually just create an unnecessary gamble on our future. There's a 50-50 chance that it actually goes over the 1.5 degree target and takes us into a climate catastrophe scenario. So this is actually what people outside the Houses of Parliament are saying. So the Queen's speech has been announced, 22 bills, one of them being the Environment Bill. Lots of bluster about how big this is for the environment, how this is kind of setting up a new environmental legislative agenda in a post-Brexit landscape. But really, if you actually analyse the speech itself, only 6 words were dedicated to climate change. And that's not even a tweet. And what we see is that even though there are some welcome environmental policies, and particularly having legally binding targets for biodiversity loss and air pollution, giving powers to local levels, it's not actually an environmental bill that reflects being in an emergency. And still, the looming spectre of the 2050 target that puts us at a 50-50 chance of going into above 1.5 degrees and into a climate catastrophe scenario is still there. And so we see once again that the government is playing lip service to the climate crisis, even though it's making a big deal out of it, which shows that it's listening to us, but once again it's not acting.
That was earlier on Monday, and now I'm wondering, what did you make of that Queen's speech? It's like, for as much as I could tell, she basically said 6 words about the environment, and isn't that a little bit like when Marie Antoinette is like, let them eat cake?
No, it's not, because I think Marie Antoinette had power to decide on food policies in the French Revolutionary times, whereas the Queen is delivering a speech that she didn't write as some kind of symbolic function for the government. Now, what's interesting is that the Queen's speech was given in Parliament. We know that 6 months ago Parliament declared a climate emergency, and yet they dedicated 6 words to the climate. They didn't even mention emergency. They said, I think they said something like, we prioritise the climate. So we've been trying to think of 6-word responses to how we feel about the rebellion. My best so far is how we feel about the Queen's speech. In 6 words: rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yes, very good. Yes, that's very good. I like it.
And we put that in a tweet.
Just 6 words, that's all you need. It fits in a tweet.
So it's really interesting though, okay, what do I think about it? I think that if it were normal times and we weren't in an existential emergency, that would be a pretty solid innings for a government. They have good legislative targets for biodiversity loss. They have giving like control for local councils to like regulate pollution. There's like little levies on plastic bags and plastics in general. And like all of that is good, but then there's this like huge stinking elephant in the room, which is that its legislative target for 2050 to go net zero carbon is basically a 50-50 chance of putting our country and the whole world in the kind of way of catastrophic climate breakdown.
Right.
So it's like, come on guys.
When you said big stinking elephant in the room, I thought you were going to say Extinction Rebellion.
Well, it's the big stinking elephant outside the room.
Right, exactly.
And what's interesting is that, you know, I was on the talk radio, like, you know, defending disruption.
Yeah.
Which was really great. I was expecting this kind of right-wing shock jock, and instead the guy was from Northern Ireland, and he's like, you're Irish. And I'm like, I'm Irish. Be easy on me.
Oh, nice.
But, you know, in response to disruption, along with apologising, I just made the point that Extinction Rebellion is a little baby. It's 1 year old. But in that year, by standing firm on going net zero carbon by 2025, which is a generation sooner, what you're seeing is all the political parties drift and come towards the sanity of our policy. And so you've had Lib Dems move down to 2045, you've had Labour move down to 2030.
Right.
And the question is back at the government, why is there a 20-year gulf between the government and a major opposition party on one of the biggest issues of our time? So we'd like to hear a response to that.
It really doesn't make sense to me. It's like, when I hear all of this stuff going on, all of these like numbers and figures and all of these different conversations and stuff, I'm like, but like the sea is rising. There are animals that have been under the ice, dead, and the ice is melting, and like the apocalypse, the dead are rising. Like, how can people be talking about like 20 this, 20 that, 20 this? It's like, do something!
I think 20 this, 20 that should be like a rap album for climate change.
Yeah, right.
But I think the real reason is because financial elites run and control the system, and the government is some kind of lame puppet. And that's why today Extinction Rebellion turned its view and focus to the financial system that is pouring trillions and trillions of pounds into fossil fuel projects around the world. And so we'll take you back to the most dramatic moments from that.
Well, I'm here. It's a wet and soggy morning outside the Bank of England, you can see behind me, where rebels have been gathering since about 7 o'clock this morning to protest financial institutions' funding of climate change. Now, what does that funding look like? Well, every year since the Paris Agreement, banks' funding of fossil fuels has gone up to the tune of $654 billion last year alone. Now, 33 global banks since that Paris Agreement have funded fossil fuels to the tune of $1.9 trillion. So there is no question as to what the protest here is focused on.
Despite the adverse weather conditions, heavy police presence and beeping queues of traffic, rebels were out in force. By mid-morning, numbers had swelled to the hundreds, all gathered in the middle of the road in the shadow of some of Britain's most notorious financial institutions. I caught up with a few of them to see how they were getting on and why the banks are one of the movement's primary targets.
They help to continue to enable fossil fuel companies to dominate the market and make a profit at everyone's expense.
And what do you hope the outcome of this action might be?
The whole point for me is to put pressure on government, because our government is irresponsible by not addressing the approaching climate crisis. I'm in my 60s, I've known about this for 40 years. I'm sitting here in a principled, non-violent way, expecting to be arrested.
I'm on my holiday. Nothing better than standing in the city in the pouring rain. I can't think of any better way. I've got 2 kids at home. I'm fighting for their future. I think at the root of everything we're fighting is the money, the banks. The numbers are clear. Barclays have invested, I think, around 80 billion in fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement, and the fossil fuels reserves we've got now are going to take us over 1.5 degrees, and some say over 2. So this is the source of it. This is what we've got to fight.
But do actions like these achieve their stated aim? After all, raising awareness is one thing, but affecting real change is another entirely. To find out more about how Extinction Rebellion plans to disrupt financial institutions funding fossil fuels, I caught up with one of the movement's co-founders, Gail Bradbrook.
One of the key things that drive the destruction of our planet is the finance system and how it's operating currently and where it's putting its money. You can have lots of conversations about what kind of economic system we should have, but very simple facts are that 2 trillion has been invested in new fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement, and a further 5 trillion is planned, and about 1/6 of the money comes from this city of London, about 33 big banks involved in it globally. Even the fossil fuel infrastructure that we already have is enough to take us over the 2 degrees C. Simply cannot have new fossil fuel industry. The only way you can justify it is on the basis that some technology is going to come along and suck the stuff out of the atmosphere. Meanwhile, we're cutting down trees that do the sucking out of the atmosphere already and denuding nature, which captures carbon. So it's just a nonsense. It's interesting, isn't it, that building? Look what it looks like. It's like a temple. finance is really good for that, you know. It's like it wants us to worship at that temple. They will not do anything, so let's not talk about them, it's about us actually. They won't do anything without pressure, and this is a cool civil disobedience today, but actually what we need to do, in my opinion, and I'm working on with others in XR, is stop paying our debts off and actually take money out of the system with no intention of paying it back.
So there could perhaps be a new angle on how to tackle banks with non-violent direct actions. But that didn't deter many of the activists who stuck to the tried and tested methods. Sitting in the road with little or no protection from the elements barring a waterproof jacket and in some cases the odd umbrella, arrestables waited patiently for their turn to be carried away.
Thank you.
It's worth it. They need to listen to XR. They need to listen to the Safe for the Planet.
Jesus, guys. They make way.
Outside the City of London Magistrates Court, the scene of the trials of many activists detained during the April uprising, those who had been arrested were lined up against a wall to await their fate. Despite the ever-constant rain, the mood remained cheery. And with the action continuing just a few yards up the road, those who had been arrested remained within earshot of the entertainment.
Welcome back. So dramatic events at Bank. But of course, I'm always aware that that's just our side of the story, and it's important to take into account maybe what more of the establishment financial system says. So I have this quote from the IMF. "The risk of catastrophic and irreversible disaster is rising, implying potentially infinite costs of unmitigated climate change, including human extinction."
Wow, that's the International Monetary Fund.
Yes, those eco-radical zealots at the International Monetary Fund. So it's just one of these moments where the moral legitimacy of finance is just crumbling.
Yeah, right.
So what did you see today?
Oh my god, it was amazing. It was so great to see the rebels just really out in their strength after these days of like rain and the real intensity of emotion of the grief march. It was so good to see them out again, like accordions, klezmer bands, Hare Krishnas.
What's a klezmer band?
A klezmer band is like, there's like, you know, it's like a type, it's a bit like Jewish Kaylee.
Nice.
Yeah, and they had like speakers and singers and spokespeople, and like it was, and that's exactly what it was like. And everyone was like dancing. It was so good. It really just reminded me about the joy of the regenerative culture. That's really like what the rebellion is. The rebellion. No, but seriously, actually, the Jewish people were there in such strength today. Did you hear about the rabbi that got arrested?
Yeah, on The Guardian today.
Right, exactly. It's on The Guardian, and it's this rabbi called Jeffrey Newman, and he is so inspiring. He went there in his full vestments with other people from the different faith communities that have really been such a strong part of this rebellion, and that right outside of the Bank of England, I received a message. This is exactly what he said just moments before he was arrested. He said, "It's impossible, at least for me, to read the Bible of prophets without recognizing how much we are rooted in the earth and in social justice, in an awareness of the world around us, and attempting to give all that we have on its behalf seems to me the highest calling of God." Isn't that amazing? That just moments before he's going to be arrested, it's like, that is the service that he holds inside of him. And I think so many of the rebels, even if they don't know how to express it, they don't know what scripture to point towards to be able to justify themselves, that's the way that they're moving when they're in these protests.
And what I love is that, you know, all week we've been defending claims of being a hippie, and then this like old man rooted in the depth of tradition is just bringing it so hard.
Oh, do you know what else brought it so hard? Today outside Bank, I saw somebody that my 9-year-old self would have been pretty excited to meet.
Some of our viewers might recognise my fellow rebel here from the hit TV programme Game of Thrones. Hi Jerome.
Hello there.
What?
I've never done a selfie interview like this, it's quite
Wow,
strange.
look at that, pioneering with every shot. So
Jerome, why are you out here today supporting Extinction Rebellion?
I just couldn't bear it any longer, and my heart was just like, oh, I've got to be with everybody, and I'm here to find out and to support, to gather and collaborate together in, you know, the most important cause of our generation and our history and of our lives. So that's why I'm here, because everything I've heard kind of about XR and what's happening, what they're doing, rings very true in my heart. I think protest is a crucial part of what has to happen for the change that we need to happen to occur. So, because you get the feeling if we don't protest and shout for it, the nature of our system and our culture, we're so embedded in it that the shift that we need, the speed that we need it just needs to happen now. So, you know, the uncomfortability and the disruption that is being caused, it's not really us that's causing it. It's our system, and it's the embeddedness of that, and it's the government, the political system we have is causing the disruption. That's why we're here.
Thank you.
Oh, my love. You know that guy? It's Jerome Flynn from Robson and Jerome.
The guy from Game of Thrones.
Yeah, he's also from Game of Thrones.
I love that character in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
I love his deep cynicism, throughout, and he's surrounded by all of these noble leaders, but he just retains this I'm going to look out for myself. And I find it jarring that his real life character is at an Extinction Rebellion protest. Is that weird? Am I too heavily invested in Game of Thrones?
He said he was just very prepared to come and do whatever he could using his public profile to bring awareness to the cause. I thought it was very noble. Winter is coming.
Well, yeah, but this is it, right? So the thing that I love most about Game of Thrones is that it's one big mytho-poetic explanation of the Extinction Rebellion narrative. Right. You have all of these feudal kings and tribes vying for this earthly claim to the Iron Throne, and all of us, and then behind the wall, behind the veil of ignorance, you have the army of the dead, i.e. our shared impending death, just marching upon us. And you have Jon Snow. He's called Jon Snow, so on some level he's already kind of infected with climate awareness. Is bringing the message down. But
Jon Snow is infected with climate awareness. Yes, that's the piece that's missing.
And in this case, infection is a good thing. But so then Jon Snow is trying to convince all the kings, hey, stop fighting each other, i.e. stop arguing over Brexit and look at the thing going on beyond the wall. And the only way he can get their attention is by capturing one of the army of the dead soldiers, putting them into a little trunk, and then bringing the trunk down south, and then unleashing the dead soldier in front of all of them. And then when the dead soldier is running at them, they finally get it. And my question is, what is the equivalent of that moment in week 2 of Rebellion, where we can viscerally present to all of the political parties that this thing that we're talking about isn't some abstract concept, it is real?
Well, I think that's what the Global Justice Rebellion has been doing over and over and over again. They're saying that it's not just something on the other side of a wall, it's something that's happening to people all around the world right now, and bringing that message front and centre and saying that look, people are dying. This is the dead. This is really happening.
And I think yes. And also, what's interesting is that as we move, in a way, week 2 is this kind of journey through the system of power and vulnerability. So in these opening days, we've had really shine the spotlight on who has power in the system. But then in the next few days, we're going to move into vulnerability, and the core vulnerability is in food. And it's this really interesting thing of it's not about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, where are we, blah, 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 atmospheric, la, la, la. It's actually really simply drought, heat wave, flooding, crop failure, and then seeing that this isn't something in the future, that winter is already here. I love this. I know that it's kind of stereotypical for an Irish person to be talking about potatoes, but Germany is the largest producer of potatoes in Europe, and its crop yield declined by 1/4.
Yes.
Poland is the largest producer of onions in Europe, and its crop fell by 50%.
Wow.
And so you have and then our fruit and veg in the UK, along with countries all around the world, is basically 77% of it comes from overseas. So what happens when we have the hottest July on record? for 5 months in a row.
5 years in a row? 5 months in a row?
Yeah, 5. You know, like this is the visceral reality of climate emergency that I think we need to land in week 2.
So I was queuing up for some food in Trafalgar Square, and there was somebody behind me. He was a Turkish man, and he just walked into the site at Trafalgar Square, and we sort of started chatting. I've got a great grandmother who's Turkish, and he said to me, "Is it really true that we have 12 years?" And I said, "Yeah, mate." And I started quoting these percentages of crop failures, 50% of the onions in Poland and this stuff. And it was just like, for him to receive that whilst also receiving a bowl of warm, nourishing food from the movement was just this moment of like real coming together of like what Extinction Rebellion's doing and then what's happening in the rest of the world.
And so is it true that you haven't washed yourself since the beginning of time, or at least the beginning of this rebellion?
So we do have some viewers who are watching who are very, very concerned about my personal hygiene. They keep telling me I need to have a wash. So today I went out and I saw what I could do about getting a bit cleaner. I mean, we do like to have a laugh at Extinction Rebellion TV, but there are some things to do with people's personal needs that are not funny. I can go and find a friend somewhere that I could go and have a shower in their house, but we know that all of last week police were confiscating the bits and pieces that XR had gathered together so that our disabled rebels could join us in protest. Let's see a report about that now.
I'm outside New Scotland Yard, which is the home of the Metropolitan Police. The scene behind me now is fairly peaceful, but yesterday this whole area was filled with a sea of rebels who were coming out in solidarity of the disabled rebels who have had the things that they need to safely protest confiscated by the police throughout this rebellion. Because this is a fluid rebellion, because we're seeing democracy in action, when the disabled rebels had their right to protest obstructed by the police, this solidarity action was quickly organised. We've seen in this last week that this rebellion is determined to carry on, and the police can see this too. So is it ignorant of them to assume that some of these rebels won't have special access needs that need to be provided for in order for their legal right to protest to be upheld? Shortly after the rebels had gathered in this park behind me, the first arrestables arrived. The first arrestables went over to the entrance of this relatively minor junction. 2 of them tried to glue themselves together right here, and they were swarmed very quickly by police. Soon after that, we saw a group of rebels huddling together on the ground over here. They began to sing the songs that are so typical of this movement, the songs that help hold morale. You can imagine their feeling of separation as the police lined up all along this pathway and along the other 2 sides of this intersection. The point of this rebellion is not heroics or glory, but undoubtedly one of the most inspiring scenes yesterday was when rebels in their hundreds packed out this pavement in order to cheer their gratitude to the rebels who had been arrested as they were transported by the police along this bus lane and up to the police vans that were waiting at the other side of the road. Now, whilst there is an awful lot that is said about individual sacrifice and people being willing to sacrifice their liberty, one of the other really important parts of this rebellion is the enormous gratitude that is felt within the movement for those who are willing to be arrested, and the enormous gratitude that is felt by you at home as you watch this taking place. This is Sara Zaltash for EXOTV.
So yeah, like really sobering, and I think that everyone's aware of the sacrifice that rebels are making, but then people who have a disability or have, you know, physical or mental health issues, it's just a whole other level of sacrifice. And I'm just wondering, I'm curious, you know, what is your experience of this?
Well, I have epilepsy, and that's nowhere near the same as being in a wheelchair or any other ways that really require a lot of assistance or support in order to be able to protest. But it's definitely been hard for me being in these sites that the police have been using really strong tactics to try to close down. Like the Trafalgar Square today, now that the roadblocks have gone, is basically a no-go area for me because the pollution is so strong that I'm almost constantly at the edge of having a seizure. Like walking between Trafalgar Square and Bank today, I just felt like I was in this really disturbing and difficult place to be in. And whilst that's, like I said, nowhere near the same as like having disabled ramps, disabled toilets, wheelchairs taken away, I do feel like the police, I do feel like it doesn't get taken into account that people have all sorts of different needs while they're protesting.
Yeah, it's almost like you just lump them in as this like hardy anarchist that you can be rough and tough with, rather than like, you're a 70-year-old woman, or you have epilepsy, or you're in a wheelchair.
Yes, exactly. And it's this idea that people have that, like, in order to be part of, like, any kind of protest movement, you have to be, like, rugged and tough. And it goes into that stereotype of, like, crusties again. And it's like, no, we're fragile, vulnerable people. Like, we're doing this, we're sacrificing our well-being in order to try to literally lay our bodies on the line to halt this like great biodiversity loss, the ecological crisis, and like for that to be really like held with care by the movement. I think that's definitely been happening this time, but by the police are acting like, yeah, we're all just soldiers.
And so because of your epilepsy, you're not unarrestable.
Yes.
But you managed to get arrested.
Yes, I did. And I did say to them, and in the moment that I was being arrested, it was like everything was like...
I have epilepsy, stop!
I did literally was saying to him, you don't arrest me, I have epilepsy, this is going to be way worse for you than you think it's going to be. Like, literally, it is not worth your while. And in fairness to them, they were very kind to me, they were very attendant to my needs, but still, for like 4 days afterwards, my nervous system was shot, and I had to spend way more time recovering than I think an able-bodied person would have to do. And none of that system of like going into the police like station, going into any of those cells, none of that system is set up for anybody with any kind of neurodiversity. And I really wonder what it's like when they're arresting people who are disabled. Like, actually, is the system set up to be able to deal with those people, or is it quite a prejudice system that just assumes everybody is able-bodied?
Yeah, particularly for breaking the law, it's like those rules of how do you engage with someone with complex needs don't apply.
Right, exactly.
And so, you know, we're week 2 into the rebellion. And in a way, we're halfway through, and it's kind of hard to believe that. You're like, oh my God, as I said, we've been here for 4,000 years.
Yes.
But it's interesting as we like do this rebellion, we're also getting lots of feedback from the public. There's anger, there's joy, and it's this pause for reflection about our tactics and our methods and who we are. And in a way, it won't be resolved until the dust settles. Like, that is what regenerative culture time is about. It's about really just like resting, taking stock, having the difficult conversations from the conflict that come up during the rebellion, really like reflecting on what went well, what didn't go well. But I can't help but notice that that's already happening now in it. And you're both faced with the daily pressure of just, you know, doing the rebellion and adjusting in real time and sitting with all the emotions that are coming up. So I was curious to ask you, what do you feel is you're noticing in that space? Is there anything coming up for you, let's say about XOR's approach, that you feel, I can imagine that shifting next time?
I think that the approach to the really meticulous planning that was in place before we began, this real press in the 4 weeks leading up to the rebellion, where almost like 15 minute by 15 minutes, the whole 2 week was mapped out. Like I was like, you know, booking in different things in different places where you're like literally trying to coordinate people with like a 5-minute changeover, assuming that you're going to hold all 15 sites for the whole time, assuming that you're going to have all your sound systems set up, all of these things. And I think that that's something that's a real learning this time, is like, okay, this is going to be fluid. This is going to be something that people turn up to and are ready to just plug in wherever they can. That even the people who've come with expectations about, like, you know, a sound system or a space to be able to do whatever they're offering, they're going to still, it's been really inspiring actually that people like academics or members of the clergy or people who generally are used to working in quite structured, formal environments are just coming and being like, okay, what can I do? Where can I plug in? And I think that's a real learning.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And in a way, now is really about resolve. It's about, we're still at the halfway point, and it's like, how can we find that strength to keep going? And one of the ways and the areas we find it is by actually looking to our leaders. And it's ironic that one of our leaders happens to be much younger, Greta Thunberg, and also the teenage climate activists from around the world, this kind of beacon of how the next generation can lead and take power into their own hands.
Yes.
And yesterday we projected Greta Thunberg's speech onto the Houses of Parliament. It was wicked. I was very nervous when we were doing it, along with the faces of teenage climate activists who also from minority backgrounds and representing indigenous communities who just often are kind of overshadowed by kind of the myth of Greta.
Greta.
Make America Greta again. It's the best tweet I've ever come up with, and 3 people retweeted it.
Oh yeah.
So we're going to take you back to highlights from the bridge. It's been 6 months since Parliament declared a climate emergency, and since then the government has done nothing. Okay, so we've been kicked off Westminster Bridge, where we've been trying to project the speech that Greta Thunberg gave to the UN Assembly, in which he said to global leaders, "How dare you?" And alongside Greta, we're projecting the image of teenage activists who are on the front lines defending indigenous communities in the global south. This comes at the eve of the Queen's speech, in which the government outlines its programme for the year. Extinction Rebellion are back because we simply want to demand, if it's an emergency, what are your plans? What are the plans for different government departments? The Queen's speech is supposed to outline this, and it simply isn't. And so it's very appropriate to have the new face of the climate movement and to have Greta Thunberg say in no uncertain terms, "How dare you?" Their policy of 2050 net zero carbon neutral target is one that is playing a gamble with our children's future. It basically puts at 50% chance that will blow our 1.5 degree target, and that is something that creates drought, heat waves, mass migration, social collapse as the new norm. And we simply say we cannot take that chance with our children's future. And what's interesting is that the reason that it is an emergency is because it's not just about temperature increase, it's the impact that has on crop failure. 77% of our fruit and veg comes from overseas. What is the likelihood of supermarket shelves being empty in the future? These are the questions that the British government want to ask. This is what we want to know about. And the question is, the government haven't done any contingency planning for food security at all. And so will that be in the Queen's speech? These are the questions that need to be asked on the eve of the Queen's speech in a time of emergency. I'm Ronan Harrington. Thank you. So, moving and dramatic images involving me on Westminster Bridge.
What are they doing? The police are just like pushing you gently away.
It was a really odd experience. They were basically just like, "Move along now," as if like I was some kind of like Babe the sheep pig, just kind of like.
You're like, "I'm filming for EXOTV."
It was like very, very gentle, and but I was trying to get like the take in on the bridge with the stuff in the background. So I was like walking backwards, trying to vaguely remember my points and repeating myself endlessly, and like looking over their shoulder and like wondering at what point do I walk slow enough backwards that I may be arrested, and then secretly wishing that this is the moment I've been arrested. And yeah, it was a grand old spiritual time.
The moment of arrest, I think, is like the moment of death. Like it feels like whoa, loads of crazy stuff, and then when you release into it, you're like, oh, this is right. They're quite...
And like for the first time in your life, you've got nothing to do for 24 hours.
Exactly, and they let me smoke fags. They gave me a Danielle Steele novel. It's quite nice, really.
So week two.
Week two.
So basically, it's as I said, in a way, the way I'm looking and understanding about it is that it's this journey through power and vulnerability in the system. We had Monday of being like the power of finance and how it's fueling climate catastrophe, and then on Tuesday it's going into the shared vulnerability of food security, and there's going to be roadblocks in kind of areas that are all about food distribution to kind of give us a feeling of what that would be like.
I hope the Harry Krishners are there.
Yes, it would be ironic if they weren't.
Yes, yeah. What's happening on Wednesday?
Wednesday there's going to be demonstrations at old and new media. So it's ironic that we're using the medium of Facebook to announce a demonstration, and that's all I can say about it.
And then on Thursday, there's like a secret surprise action.
Yeah, I think that, watch this space. I think it's going to be very interesting what happens on Thursday. This is all about really taking the whole rebellion to a crescendo.
It's like, even we don't know. Like, there are secrets, and then there are actual secrets. There's like loads of XR secrets that aren't really secrets, they just like press things. But this is actually, like, we don't know.
It's beyond our pay grade.
Yeah.
Even though we're all paid the same.
Yeah. Most of us volunteering, so yeah.
And then on Friday, it's going to come together in the original core of the rebellion, which is just continuing to ask the government a very basic question. What is your plan?
So, government, what is your plan? We just want to know, because otherwise we die. Die not good. Plan? What is plan?
Thank you for joining us today. This has been the Systems Change version of Wayne's World. I'm Ronan Harrington.
I'm Sara Zaltash.
Goodbye.